My name is Iris Evans. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been known as the steady one. I live in Seattle, where the sky is often gray and the coffee is strong enough to hold you upright on its own. Professionally, I work as a project coordinator for a mid sized architecture firm. It's not glamorous, but it requires precision, patience, and the ability to see problems before they happen. Personally, I'm a wife, or at least that's the role I stepped into 5 years ago with more optimism than self awareness. Most people describe me the same way: calm, dependable, thoughtful. The kind of woman who remembers birthdays without reminders, the kind who keeps conversations smooth at dinner parties, the kind who doesn't make things difficult. There's a compliment hidden inside that description. And there's also a warning. What people often miss is that calm doesn't mean unaware. Dependable doesn't mean unshakable, and not difficult doesn't mean without depth. When I entered marriage, I carried a quiet expectation I never said out loud. I believed love would refine him, soften his edges, teach him attentiveness. I thought patience was power, that if I modeled stability long enough, he would eventually rise to meet it. Instead, something else happened. Marriage held up a mirror I wasn't ready to face. The story I'm about to tell isn't about betrayal in the dramatic sense. There were no screaming matches that shattered dishes, no shocking secrets revealed in the night. It was subtler than that, slower. It unfolded in small moments that would look ordinary to anyone standing outside them. But inside those moments, something was eroding. This isn't a revenge story. I didn't destroy anyone's life. I didn't orchestrate humiliation. What I did was much quieter and much more irreversible. I had to confront a truth I'd spent years avoiding. I wasn't waiting for him to grow. I was hiding from the parts of myself that were afraid to demand more. In this story, you'll see how invisibility can become a habit, how silence can masquerade as virtue, and how sometimes the person who needs to change isn't the one everyone expects. I'll walk you through the first small dismissals I brushed aside, the role I slowly accepted without realizing it, the moment something shifted inside me, not loudly, but permanently, and the choices I made after that shift. I won't dramatize it. I won't exaggerate it. I'll tell it the way it felt: restrained, thoughtful, deliberate. Because sometimes emotional justice doesn't look like fireworks. Sometimes it looks like clarity, and clarity, once it arrives, doesn't leave. If you've ever entered a relationship believing love would transform someone else, have you ever paused to ask what it was quietly asking you to confront about yourself instead? When Daniel introduced me to people, he always smiled in a way that suggested he was presenting something dependable. "This is Iris," he'd say. "She keeps me organized." It was meant as praise. At dinners with his colleagues, I became the one who remembered everyone's names by the second meeting. I refilled glasses before they were empty. I laughed softly at stories I'd already heard twice. When the conversation turned technical or political, I stayed observant, not silent exactly, just measured. I had opinions. I simply learned early that offering them shifted the air in a way that made Daniel subtly tense, so I stopped. To his friends, I was sweet. To his mother, I was low maintenance. To his sister, I was lucky to have someone as driven as Daniel. And to Daniel, I was on stable ground. He was charismatic, quick thinking, the kind of man who could enter a room and pull gravity toward himself. He worked in tech consulting, high energy, high reward. People admired his ambition. They mistook my steadiness as a contrast rather than a compliment. In private, he would kiss my forehead and say, "I don't know what I'd do without you. You're my calm." It sounded romantic, but over time I began to notice the translation. My calm meant I absorbed tension without reflecting it back. My steadiness meant I adjusted before he had to. My understanding meant he didn't have to explain himself twice. At family gatherings, I helped his mother in the kitchen without being asked. When plans changed at the last minute because of his work, I told my own friends, "It's okay, something came up." When he forgot commitments, I smoothed the edges so no one blamed him. I became the quiet infrastructure beneath his visible life. And the strange thing is, I took pride in that. I told myself that being needed was the same as being valued, that emotional maturity meant not reacting to every disappointment. That love looked like patience extended indefinitely. There were moments when people underestimated me outright. Once, at a holiday party, one of his colleagues turned to me and asked, "So what do you actually do?" I explained my role at the firm: timelines, vendor negotiations, and cost projections. He blinked, surprised. "Oh, you're more analytical than I thought." More than you thought. I smiled. I get that a lot. Daniel squeezed my shoulder lightly, as if to smooth over the awkwardness. Later in the car, he said, "Don't take that personally. You come off gentle." Gentle. It became a container others placed me in. Inside it, I was agreeable, supportive, and emotionally available on demand. What they didn't see was how much I noticed. I noticed when Daniel interrupted me mid-sentence at dinner. I noticed when he described our shared decisions as his ideas. I noticed how often I prefaced my thoughts with, "This might be silly, but..." No one told me to shrink, not directly. It happened gradually, through raised eyebrows, through subtle impatience, through the relief in a room when I chose not to push a point further. In marriage, I assumed roles solidified because they were natural. Only later did I realize that roles solidify because they are repeated. I wasn't invisible. I was predictable. Predictably agreeable. Predictably forgiving. Predictably accommodating. And when you are predictable in your softness, people begin to rely on it the way they rely on furniture. Necessary, appreciated, rarely examined. If you had asked Daniel back then who I was, he would have said, "She's my rock." What he meant was, "She doesn't move." And for a long time, I mistook stillness for strength. But there's a quiet difference between being grounded and being rooted in place because you're afraid that shifting might make everything unstable. I didn't yet understand that the version of me they admired was also the version that cost me the most. The first small cut didn't look like a wound. It looked like a joke. We were at dinner with another couple, friends of Daniel's from work. The kind of restaurant with dim lighting and menus that don't list prices. I remember the smell of rosemary and butter, the low hum of conversation, the way the candlelight softened everyone's features. Daniel was telling a story about a project he had recently led. I had helped him prepare for that presentation, stayed up late reviewing his slides, reorganizing his argument so it flowed better. He'd thanked me the night before, kissed my cheek, said, "You're a lifesaver." At the table, he described the strategy shift that ultimately secured the contract. "That pivot was risky," one of his colleagues said. "How did you decide to take it?" Daniel shrugged modestly. "Instinct, I guess. I just had a feeling. I felt it before I thought it. A flicker. Not anger, not even disappointment, just a quiet recalibration. Because the pivot had been my suggestion. I remember placing my water glass down very carefully. I waited for him to glance at me, maybe to add, "Iris actually pointed that out. Something small, a thread of acknowledgement." He didn't. The conversation moved on. Later that night in the car, I mentioned it lightly. "You know, that pivot you described, that was something we talked through together." He kept his eyes on the road. "Yeah, of course. We talked through everything." I waited. "But it was my call," he added, not defensive, just factual. There it was. I nodded. "Right. The first small cut isn't sharp enough to protest. It's subtle enough to doubt yourself. Was I looking for credit? Was I being overly sensitive? Isn't marriage about shared wins anyway?" That's how I rationalized it. A few weeks later, it happened again. Different setting, same pattern. We were at his parents' house. His father complimented the way Daniel had restructured his investment portfolio. "Smart move diversifying like that." Daniel smiled. "Yeah, I've been reading up on it." I had spent 2 weekends researching those options. I had built the spreadsheet. I had walked him through risk percentages over coffee at our kitchen table. I watched his mother glance at me briefly, almost curiously, as if she sensed something unspoken. I said nothing, because technically it was his portfolio, because technically he had made the final decision, because technically this wasn't a lie. It was simply an omission, and omissions are harder to confront. The third time was quieter. We were alone. I had suggested we postpone a large purchase, a new car, because I noticed some irregularities in his quarterly bonus projections. He brushed it off at first. Later, after reviewing the numbers again, he agreed. 2 months after that, when a colleague mentioned rising interest rates, Daniel said, "Good thing I decided to hold off on upgrading the car." I felt the pattern settle. It wasn't that he was stealing ideas with malice. He wasn't scheming. He wasn't trying to erase me. He just didn't instinctively think to include me. And I didn't instinctively insist. The first small cut teaches you something dangerous, that your contribution is optional. Optional acknowledgement, optional visibility, optional presence. And once something becomes optional, it slowly becomes invisible. That night, lying in bed beside him, I stared at the ceiling and asked myself a question I didn't want to answer. If I disappeared from the decision-making, would anything about how he presents himself actually change? The thought felt disloyal. I pushed it away. I told myself he worked hard. that he deserved confidence, that I didn't need public recognition to feel secure. But somewhere deeper, a quieter truth formed. It wasn't about credit, it was about being seen. And the first time you realize someone can benefit from your presence without fully acknowledging it, something inside you shifts, even if you don't yet know what to call it. I didn't confront him, I didn't withdraw, I didn't change anything. Not yet, but I remembered. And sometimes remembering is the beginning of everything. The unsettling thing about small cuts is how quickly the skin learns to expect them. After a while, you stop flinching. Not because it doesn't hurt, but because reacting every time would make you look fragile. And I had built an identity around being composed. The pattern became familiar. Daniel would present a polished version of something we had built together. Friends would compliment his foresight. Family would praise his decisiveness. I would sit beside him smiling, quietly editing the narrative in my head. It wasn't that he erased me deliberately. He just defaulted to singular language. I decided. I figured. I handled it. And I defaulted to silence. When you love someone, you become skilled at explaining their behavior in ways that protect them. He's under pressure. He doesn't think in terms of credit. He assumes I know he values me. That last one became my favorite shield. One evening, we hosted dinner at our apartment. I had planned the menu, rearranged the living room for better flow, and even coached Daniel through how to navigate a sensitive conversation with one of his friends who had recently lost a job. The night went smoothly. Everyone left impressed with how effortless Daniel made entertaining look. After the door closed, he exhaled dramatically. "See, I told you it would be fine." I looked at the stack of plates in my hands. "Yes," I said, "you did." It was such a small thing. But in that moment, I felt something more complex than annoyance. I felt complicit, because I had curated the image too. I had supported the illusion of effortlessness. I had made it easy for him to forget the work behind the scenes. And slowly I began to notice something else. He interrupted me more frequently, not harshly, not dismissively in tone, just efficiently. If I took too long explaining a point, he would summarize it. If I hesitated, he would fill the silence. At gatherings, he would answer questions directed at both of us. "At what point do you two want kids?" someone asked once. Daniel responded before I could inhale. "Not for a few years. We're focused on career growth." We had discussed it, yes, but the answer felt like it belonged to him alone. On the drive home, I said gently, "You answered that pretty quickly." He shrugged. "We agreed, didn't we?" "We did. So?" "So." That word closed doors. I began to measure my reactions carefully. Was this disrespect, or was this simply a difference? Was I being sidelined, or was I too sensitive? The mind can rationalize almost anything when the alternative is destabilizing. If I admitted this was a pattern, then I would have to decide whether it mattered. And if it mattered, I would have to speak up. And if I spoke up, I risked being perceived as difficult. The one trait I had quietly built my life avoiding. So I adjusted. I told myself strong women don't need applause. That emotional maturity means not competing with your partner. Keeping the peace is more important than claiming space. But something subtle shifted inside me. I stopped offering ideas as quickly. I began observing more than contributing. I started documenting things. Not in a dramatic way, just mentally noting timelines, conversations, decisions. When you normalize being overlooked, you begin to separate internally. Outwardly, I remained the same, supportive, calm, cooperative. Inwardly, I began to detach in fractions. I noticed how often he relied on my emotional labor to smooth conflicts with his family, to remember anniversaries, to manage social obligations. If I pulled back slightly, even experimentally, small things fell through cracks. He would say, half laughing, "What would I do without you?" And I would think, not notice until it was too late. That thought startled me the first time it formed. Because it wasn't affectionate. It wasn't resentful either. It was observational. That's the danger of normalizing disrespect. You don't explode, you don't leave dramatically, you become analytical. You begin to study the system you're inside. And I was starting to see something clearly. The role I occupied in our marriage wasn't accidental. It was reinforced by him, by others, and by me. The most uncomfortable realization wasn't that he interrupted me. It was that I had taught him it was safe to, by never insisting otherwise, by smiling through it, by translating his omissions into innocence. Marriage hadn't changed him. It had revealed me. And I wasn't sure yet whether that revelation was a threat or an invitation. There's a moment in every long relationship when you realize you are no longer improvising. You're performing a part. It happened on an ordinary Sunday afternoon. Laundry humming in the background. Rain tapping against the windows. Daniel was at the kitchen island, laptop open, half listening as I described a scheduling conflict with my own work project. He nodded absently. "You'll figure it out. You always do." It was meant to be reassuring, but something about the phrasing made me pause. "You'll figure it out. Not we. How can I help?" Just an assumption of my quiet competence, as if my challenges were self-contained systems I would solve without assistance. Later that evening, we were reviewing our calendar for the week. A client dinner for him on Tuesday, a networking event on Thursday, his gym sessions, his calls. My commitments floated in the margins. "Can you reschedule your thing on Thursday?" he asked. "It would be good if you came to the networking event. You make a great impression." My thing. It was a presentation I had been preparing for 3 weeks. "I can't move it," I said calmly. He looked surprised. "It's just internal, right?" Just. There it was again. That subtle reduction. Not malicious, not even conscious, but persistent. In that moment, something clarified with uncomfortable precision. I had been cast as the supporting character in a story I was also living. Reliable, flexible, understanding. The one who adjusts. I thought back over the past year. How often had I moved my schedule to accommodate his? How often had I downplayed my own deadlines because his seemed bigger? How many times had I introduced him as the driven one, reinforcing the narrative that my ambition was secondary? The role wasn't imposed with force. It was shaped by repetition. At family dinners, I was the diplomatic one. At social gatherings, I was the attentive one. At home, I was the organizer, the planner, the anticipator of needs. And the more I excelled at it, the more indispensable and invisible I became. That's the paradox. When you are consistently dependable, people stop asking whether you're tired. When you are consistently composed, people stop checking if you're hurt. When you are consistently accommodating, people stop imagining you might one day refuse. I began noticing the language Daniel used when he described us. "I'm the risk taker. She's the steady one. I chase big ideas. She keeps things grounded." It sounded balanced, but balance requires equal weight. What we had was structure. He expanded, I stabilized. And over time, stabilization began to feel like containment. The most revealing moment came during a small disagreement about finances. I had raised concerns about an aggressive investment he wanted to pursue. I laid out the numbers calmly, pointed out the volatility, and suggested a more measured approach. He sighed, not angry, just mildly impatient. "You're always so cautious, Iris. Sometimes you have to take a leap. Always." I realized he saw my caution as a limitation rather than a strategy, and I had allowed that perception to stand. That night, I sat alone at the edge of our bed, my leather planner open in my lap. I flipped through pages of carefully tracked expenses, project notes, reminders, the quiet architecture of our shared life. It struck me then, I wasn't just playing a role. I was maintaining the infrastructure of someone else's expansion, and no one, not even me, had asked whether I wanted that to be my permanent position. There's a particular loneliness in being valued primarily for what you provide. It doesn't look like neglect from the outside. It looks like stability, partnership, teamwork. But internally, it feels like standing in a room where everyone appreciates the lighting without noticing the wiring behind the walls. For the first time, I allowed myself to ask a question I had avoided. If I stopped performing this role, even slightly, who would I become in this marriage? And perhaps more unsettling, who would he be without it? The answers didn't arrive immediately, but the awareness did. And awareness, once it settles in, changes the way you stand in every room. The shift didn't happen during a fight. It didn't happen after a betrayal. It happened on a Tuesday morning in silence. I was sitting at our kitchen table before work, a mug of coffee cooling between my hands. Daniel had already left for an early meeting. The apartment was still, the kind of stillness that makes you hear the refrigerator hum. My laptop was open to our shared financial spreadsheet. I had been updating quarterly projections, something I did almost automatically every few weeks. It was routine, predictable, comfortable. But that morning, as I adjusted columns and recalculated percentages, I noticed something subtle. I wasn't doing this in partnership. I was doing it out of habit, and habit, I realized, had quietly replaced choice. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. For years, I had told myself that my steadiness was generosity, that my flexibility was maturity, that my silence was strength. But in that quiet kitchen, with no one watching, another possibility surfaced. What if my silence wasn't strength? What if it was avoidance? I had entered marriage expecting my partner to change. I thought proximity to my calm would teach him attentiveness. I thought consistency would inspire reciprocity. I believed that if I modeled the behavior I wanted, he would eventually mirror it. But that morning, I saw something with unsettling clarity. He hadn't changed because he didn't have to. The system worked. He expanded. I adjusted. He decided. I refined. He spoke. I softened. And I had mistaken my willingness to adapt for virtue, when in reality it was fear. Fear of being perceived as demanding, fear of disrupting stability, fear of becoming too much. Marriage held up a mirror I wasn't ready to face, and what I saw in it wasn't a neglected wife. It was a woman who had been quietly negotiating against herself. I thought about the first small cut at that restaurant, the omitted acknowledgments, the casual interruptions, the way I had minimized each one to maintain harmony. No one had forced me to do that. I chose it, not once, but repeatedly. The realization wasn't dramatic. It wasn't accompanied by tears. It felt almost clinical. If I continued exactly as I had been, nothing would change. Not because he was cruel, but because comfort is persuasive. I closed the spreadsheet without saving the latest updates. For the first time, I didn't send him a midday text reminding him about his afternoon call. I didn't rearrange my schedule preemptively for the week ahead. I didn't check whether he had responded to his mother's message. I simply paused. And in that pause, I felt something unfamiliar. Space. It wasn't a rebellion. It wasn't punishment. It was an observation. I wanted to see what would happen if I stopped compensating for every imbalance. That evening, when Daniel came home slightly flustered because he had forgotten a call, he laughed it off. Today was chaotic. I nodded. Sounds like it. He waited, almost subconsciously, for me to offer reassurance or logistical repair. I didn't. The silence between us wasn't tense. It was neutral. And in that neutrality, I realized something powerful. Silence doesn't always mean surrender. Sometimes it means you're no longer volunteering to carry what isn't yours. That Tuesday didn't end in confrontation. We ate dinner, we talked about his day, we went to bed. But inside me, a decision had begun forming. Not about leaving, not about revenge, about recalibration. If I wanted to be seen differently, I would have to stop reinforcing the version of me that was easiest to overlook. And that kind of change doesn't start with a speech. It starts with restraint, withholding automatic accommodation, allowing natural consequences to unfold without interference. I lay awake that night, not anxious, just alert. For the first time in years, I wasn't strategizing how to make things smoother. I was watching, and quietly, deliberately, I was preparing to become unfamiliar. In the past, my silence had been reflexive. Now it was deliberate. There's a difference you can feel in your body. Reflexive silence tightens your chest. It tastes like swallowed words. It's reactive, an attempt to avoid friction. Chosen silence is steadier. It's observational. It carries intention. I didn't announce any changes. I didn't confront Daniel with a list of grievances. I simply stopped overfunctioning. When he forgot to RSVP to a wedding invitation, I didn't quietly send the response on his behalf. We arrived slightly embarrassed when the seating was already finalized. He looked at me in the car afterward. I thought you handled that. I thought you were going to, I replied gently. Not sharp, not accusatory, just factual. He laughed awkwardly. We need a better system. We do, I thought, but I didn't say it. At home, I stopped pre-solving problems that hadn't yet reached him. If his mother called 3 times in a row, I didn't text him a reminder. If he misplaced an important document, I didn't automatically search for it. The first few times he seemed mildly inconvenienced, then slightly irritated. You've been kind of distant lately, he said one evening while scrolling through his phone. Distant? I asked calmly. Just less on top of things. There it was, on top of things, as if that had been my designated altitude. I considered explaining. I considered saying, I'm still here. I'm just not compensating anymore. But the explanation felt like undoing the experiment. Instead, I asked, on top of which things? He hesitated, realizing perhaps for the first time how many invisible systems I had been managing. I don't know, he said finally. Just stuff. Stuff. I nodded. Silence in that moment became a mirror. When I stopped smoothing the edges of his life, the texture became visible. He began double-checking his own calendar. He missed a bill payment once and seemed genuinely surprised. I could have sworn that was on autopay. It wasn't, I said. I didn't add. It was on Iris. Something subtle shifted in his tone over the next few weeks. Not gratitude yet, but awareness. A faint recognition that the ease he experienced had architecture behind it. But alongside that awareness, something else surfaced. He started mistaking my restraint for disengagement. You don't seem as invested, he said one Sunday afternoon. That word lingered. Invested. As if my previous hyper-attentiveness had been the benchmark of love. I'm still here, I said evenly. I'm just letting things unfold more naturally. He frowned slightly, as though trying to decode a language he hadn't known he relied on. And that's when I understood something important. When you withdraw excessive accommodation, people feel the absence before they understand the reason. To him, my silence looked like cooling affection. To me, it felt like self-respect calibrating. The temptation to explain was strong, to reassure him that this wasn't punishment, that I wasn't emotionally withdrawing, that I was simply redistributing responsibility. But I held back, because I needed to see something clearly. Without the distortion of negotiation, would he step forward without being prompted? Would he become curious about the shift? Or would he simply long for the previous version of me, the one who absorbed everything quietly? In social settings, I began speaking fully without abbreviating myself. If he interrupted, I finished my sentence anyway, calmly, not competitively, just completely. The first time I did that, he blinked, surprised. I smiled lightly and continued. No confrontation, no apology, just completion. Silence, I realized, isn't always the absence of voice. Sometimes it's the refusal to over-explain your evolution. And as the weeks passed, I felt something stabilizing inside me. Not anger, not detachment. Clarity. I was no longer waiting for him to notice my worth. I was observing whether he could adjust to my boundaries without being coached into them. And that difference, subtle, almost invisible from the outside, marked the beginning of a shift he hadn't yet fully recognized. But I had. Because once silence becomes a choice, it stops being weakness. It becomes leverage. There's something almost sacred about preparation done in silence. Not secretive, not manipulative, just private. While Daniel adjusted to the absence of my constant buffering, I began adjusting to something deeper. Myself. What they never noticed was that I wasn't pulling away emotionally. I was becoming structurally independent. I reopened an old savings account in my name only, not as a threat, not as an escape plan, but as clarity. I redirected a portion of my freelance consulting income there. Small amounts at first, then more deliberately. I reviewed our shared assets, not suspiciously, analytically. I had always tracked our finances, but now I studied them as if I were an advisor instead of a wife. Patterns, dependencies, risk exposure. It wasn't about leaving, it was about understanding. I enrolled in a professional certification program I had postponed twice because it conflicted with Daniel's schedule. The classes were virtual, late evenings. When he asked why I suddenly seemed so busy, I answered simply, I've been meaning to invest in this for a while. He nodded, distracted. He didn't notice that I stopped rearranging my coursework around his dinners. If he came home late and we ate separately, I didn't rush to close my laptop. I began documenting conversations more carefully, not in a dramatic ledger, but in my planner. Dates, decisions, financial discussions, shared commitments. Not because I anticipated a battle, because information is grounded. There's power in knowing exactly where you stand, emotionally and practically. In social settings, I subtly repositioned myself. If someone asked Daniel about a shared decision, I answered when appropriate. We both looked at that, I'd say gently, not accusatory, inclusive. The first few times he glanced at me with faint surprise, then something closer to recalibration. He started adding, yeah, Iris actually pointed that out. Not every time, but sometimes. And I noticed, preparation isn't always about contingency plans. Sometimes it's about identity. I revisited parts of myself that had dimmed quietly. I started writing again. Essays I never showed anyone, reflections on partnership, on autonomy, on the difference between support and self-erasure. I met an old friend for coffee without checking Daniel's schedule first. When he seemed mildly inconvenienced by the timing, I didn't apologize. I'll be back by 7, I said calmly. The more I stopped seeking implicit permission, the more I realized how often I had been asking for it, silently. What they never noticed was that my internal dialogue had changed. I was no longer asking, how do I keep this smooth? I was asking, is this reciprocal? That question became my compass. When Daniel forgot an important deadline again, I didn't rescue him. I watched him scramble. I observed how he handled pressure without my anticipatory cushioning. He managed, not gracefully, not optimally, but he managed. And that realization unsettled me more than anything. For years, I had believed that without my constant adjustment, things would collapse. They didn't. They became less polished, less seamless. But they continued, which meant something profound. My overfunctioning hadn't been necessary for survival. It had been necessary for perfection. And perfection, I began to understand, had been my shield. If everything ran smoothly, no one would question my value. But value built on invisibility is fragile, so I shifted further. I updated my resume. Not dramatically, just accurately. I reached out to a recruiter I had connected with years ago. I explored options within my firm that would require more travel, more visibility, and more leadership. I didn't tell Daniel immediately, not because I was hiding it, because I was still determining what I wanted. That was the most radical part. For the first time in years, I wasn't calibrating my ambitions against his trajectory. I was considering them independently. What they never noticed was that I wasn't growing colder. I was growing clearer. And clarity, unlike resentment, doesn't need noise. It builds quietly, intentionally, until one day you realize you're no longer preparing for balance within the old structure. You're preparing for the possibility that the structure itself may not evolve fast enough. And when that realization settles in, not emotionally, but logically, you begin to see leverage where you once saw limitation, not as a weapon, but as a choice. The reveal wasn't something I announced. It was something I understood. It happened on a Thursday afternoon in a glass-walled conference room at my firm. I had just finished presenting a revised project timeline to senior partners, a room that used to intimidate me. My voice had been steady. My data is precise. When I finished, one of the partners leaned back and said, almost casually, "We've been underutilizing you, Iris." Underutilizing. The word echoed in a way that felt almost personal. Not just professionally, systemically. After the meeting, my manager asked if I would consider stepping into a more visible leadership track. It would mean managing larger accounts, more direct authority, a significant salary adjustment. I didn't react immediately. I asked for time. On the walk back to my desk, something aligned inside me with unsettling calm. For years, I had been the quiet infrastructure, at home and at work, the stabilizer, the background strategist, the one who prevented chaos before it surfaced. And here was proof, tangible, measurable proof, that my skills were not passive traits. They were leveraging. That evening, I sat alone in my car before driving home. Rain streaked the windshield in slow lines. I opened my planner and reviewed my private notes, savings projections, certification progress, recruiter correspondence, and leadership opportunities. The numbers were clean. If I accepted the new role, my income would shift our financial dynamics significantly. Not equal, not yet, but influential. And suddenly, the architecture of my marriage looked different, not emotionally, structurally. For the first time, I saw clearly that I was not dependent. I had believed quietly that leaving, or even asserting, would destabilize everything, that I needed his momentum as much as he needed my steadiness. But the math said otherwise. More importantly, my confidence said otherwise. The private reveal wasn't that Daniel was unfair. It was that I had more agency than I had ever allowed myself to recognize. I thought back to all the times he had introduced me as the calm one, the reliable one, the cautious one. What I hadn't realized, was that caution is not weakness. It's strategic positioning. I wasn't behind him. I had simply chosen not to step forward. And that choice had felt safer than risking disruption. At home that night, Daniel mentioned another ambitious investment idea. He spoke with enthusiasm, outlining potential returns. In the past, I would have immediately opened spreadsheets, run simulations, and asked detailed questions. This time I listened, and I asked one simple thing. What's your contingency if it underperforms? He paused. I haven't thought that far yet. I have it, I said evenly. He looked at me differently then, not defensively, not dismissively. Curiously, it was subtle, but I felt it. The dynamic was recalibrating. Later, alone in our bedroom, I reviewed the leadership offer again. The salary increase, the expanded authority, the travel expectations. If I accepted, my time would no longer be infinitely elastic. My availability would no longer orbit around his calendar. I would be less convenient and more defined. The realization brought no triumph, no adrenaline, just clarity. I didn't need to threaten departure to have leverage. I needed to fully occupy my own capacity. That was the reveal. Not a secret account, not a hidden plan, but a truth. I had been negotiating my worth downward in the name of harmony, and now I understood I no longer had to. Whether the marriage adapted or not would depend on more than my silence. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of that outcome. Because the mirror marriage had held up wasn't showing me inadequacy. It was showing me underestimation, and that is a very different thing. Quietly, deliberately, I made my decision about the leadership role. I didn't tell Daniel that night. Not yet. Some truths need to settle fully inside you before you release them into a shared space. And I wanted this one anchored. Not reactive, not emotional, Irreversible. There's a difference between knowing you have options and choosing one. For weeks, I had been preparing quietly, expanding professionally, strengthening financially, recalibrating emotionally. None of it is dramatic. None of it was visible enough to alarm anyone. But clarity, once formed, demands direction. The leadership offer sat in my inbox with a deadline attached, except by Friday. If I said yes, my schedule would change, my responsibilities would increase, my income would rise, the equilibrium of our household, the one built around my flexibility, would shift permanently. If I said no, things would remain easier, smoother, predictable. I could continue being the stabilizer, the quiet strategist, the invisible reinforcement beneath Daniel's visible expansion. And perhaps over time, he might organically become more attentive, more inclusive, more aware. That had been my original belief when I entered marriage, that growth would emerge naturally from proximity. But now I understood something more sobering. Growth rarely emerges without pressure, and I had been relieving all of it. On Wednesday evening, Daniel mentioned an upcoming conference he wanted to attend out of state. "It's a great networking opportunity," he said. "I might be gone 4 days." In the past, I would have immediately adjusted my calendar, rearranged plans, and managed the logistics without hesitation. Instead, I said, "That week is when I start my new role." He blinked. "New role?" I held his gaze evenly. I accepted the leadership track. Silence. Not angry, not explosive, just recalculating. "Oh," he said finally. "Wow, that's big." "It is." He asked a few logistical questions. Travel expectations, workload. His tone was supportive on the surface. But underneath, I sensed something else. Disorientation. For the first time, my professional trajectory wasn't secondary to his. It wasn't adjustable around his commitments. It was fixed. That night, lying beside him in the dark, I felt the weight of the real decision. The promotion wasn't an irreversible choice. The irreversible choice was this. I was no longer structuring my life to accommodate his expansion at the cost of my own. That meant some conflicts would surface. Some inconveniences would remain unresolved. Some assumptions would fracture, and I would not rush to repair them. The next morning, I finalized paperwork, signed documents, updated internal systems. And then I did something quieter, something even more decisive. I stopped cushioning his ambitions with preemptive compromise. When he mentioned the conference again and realized it overlapped with one of my training sessions, I didn't say, "I'll see if I can move mine." I said, "We'll need to coordinate. I won't be able to adjust that week. The word won't land differently than can't." He looked at me carefully. "Things are changing," he said. "Yes," I agreed. He didn't ask why. He didn't say because of what. But we both felt it. This wasn't a rebellion. It wasn't punishment. It wasn't even a confrontation. It was repositioning. The decision point wasn't about leaving the marriage. It was about leaving the version of myself that had made the imbalance sustainable. And once you step out of that role, you can't convincingly return to it. There was no dramatic declaration, no ultimatum, just a quiet internal acknowledgement. If this marriage thrives, it will have to adapt to two fully occupied individuals, not one expanding and one absorbing. And if it cannot adapt, I now have the capacity to withstand that truth. That was the irreversible choice. Not divorce, not destruction, self-alignment. And self-alignment, once claimed, does not negotiate backward. Once the decision settled inside me, movement became quieter, more precise. There's something powerful about acting without announcing intention. Not out of secrecy, but out of stability. I didn't need validation for the direction I was taking. I needed consistency. My first week in the new leadership role was demanding. Longer hours, higher stakes, rooms where my input wasn't optional, it was required. I noticed something almost ironic. In that environment, I was not the calm one. I was strategic, direct, decisive. No one interrupted me. If they tried, I finished my thought. If I disagreed, I said so, calmly, without apology. At home, the contrast became visible. Daniel mentioned feeling overwhelmed by scheduling conflicts that previously never seemed to occur. "We used to be more coordinated," he said one evening. "We're both busier now," I replied. He hesitated. "You're different lately." Different. Not colder, not hostile. Just different. I didn't argue. I didn't deny it. "I'm more focused," I said. That was true. Behind the scenes, I made additional structural adjustments. I met with a financial advisor independently, not to separate assets, but to understand them fully. Retirement allocations, investment exposure, insurance policies, contingencies. Information removes fear. The more I understood our shared landscape, the less emotionally reactive I felt about it. I also updated legal documents that had been sitting untouched since we married: beneficiaries, authorizations, practical safeguards. Nothing aggressive, nothing secretive, just current. When Daniel asked why I was reviewing paperwork on a Saturday afternoon, I answered simply, "I like knowing where things stand." He nodded, slightly unsettled by the thoroughness. At work, my income shift began reflecting in our joint accounts. For the first time, my contribution wasn't supplemental, it was substantial. Daniel noticed. "That bonus was impressive," he said one night, studying the numbers. "It was earned," I replied gently. There was no competitiveness in my tone, but there was clarity. Moving in silence didn't mean withholding affection. I still cared, I still listened, I still participated, but I stopped offering emotional overextension. If he vented about work, I didn't automatically strategize solutions unless he asked. If he forgot something important, I allowed natural consequences to follow. The house felt subtly different, less orchestrated, more honest. One evening, he said, "I feel like you don't need me the way you used to." The statement lingered between us. I could have softened it, could have said, "Of course I do," could have reassured him. Instead, I answered carefully. "I want you," I said. "That's different." He went quiet. For years, I had equated being needed with being secure. Now I understand something deeper. Need creates dependency. Choice creates respect. The legal and financial adjustments I made weren't preparations for departure. They were preparations for equality. If our partnership was to continue, it would stand on mutual agency, not silent reliance. And if it faltered, I would not be destabilized. The most surprising outcome of moving in silence was this: I felt calmer than ever. Not because things were smooth, they weren't. Tension flickered occasionally. Confusion surfaced. Daniel sometimes seemed unsure how to engage this new version of me, but internally I was aligned. There is a profound steadiness that comes from knowing you can sustain yourself. Emotionally, professionally, financially. It removes urgency. It removes fear-based compromise. And when fear leaves the room, clarity sits down in its place. Daniel began trying in small ways, asking more questions, pausing before interrupting, acknowledging my input publicly more often. But I no longer measured my worth by those moments. That was the quiet shift. My actions were no longer attempts to teach him. They were commitments to myself. And once your movements are rooted in self-respect instead of correction, they become irreversible. Not because they're dramatic, but because they're aligned. The consequences of that alignment were only beginning to unfold. He felt the difference. Others would soon, but I had already crossed the threshold. And there was no version of me waiting on the other side to shrink back into place. Consequences rarely arrive with noise. They arrive with discomfort. At first, it was subtle. Daniel missed a deadline on a personal investment because I hadn't reminded him. He seemed genuinely rattled, not by the financial impact, which was manageable, but by the disruption to his sense of control. "I don't know how I let that slip," he muttered one evening, staring at his laptop. I looked up from my notes. "You've had a lot on your plate." In the past, I would have added, "I should have caught that." This time, I didn't. The sentence hung in the air differently. For years, he had experienced life as a continuous forward motion. Even when he stumbled, the fall was softened. Logistics were handled, schedules realigned, emotional reassurance provided. Now friction was more visible. At a dinner with friends, someone asked about an upcoming trip. Daniel began explaining the itinerary, then paused. "I need to double-check with Iris," he said. It was a small acknowledgement, but a public one. Later that night, he admitted quietly, "I feel like I've been assuming you just accommodate things." I met his eyes. "You have?" There was no accusation in my tone, just a fact. He nodded slowly, absorbing it. The consequences weren't explosive arguments. They were realizations accumulating. He began noticing how often he relied on me for emotional calibration. After a tense conversation with his father, he came to me as usual, expecting interpretation, reassurance, strategy. I listened. But instead of unpacking the entire dynamic for him, I asked, "What do you think you need to say next time?" He frowned slightly. "I don't know." "I think you do," I replied. The discomfort in his expression wasn't anger. It was an unfamiliar responsibility. Over time, he became more aware of the invisible labor I had withdrawn. The social planning, the anticipatory communication, the subtle smoothing of relational edges. When those systems weren't pre-managed, interactions felt rougher. One evening, after an awkward exchange with his sister about holiday plans, he sighed. "You used to help me navigate this stuff." "I still can," I said gently, "if you ask." That distinction mattered. Not automatic, intentional. The emotional consequences surfaced more slowly. He began asking, "Are you happy?" Not defensively, uncertainly. It would have been easy to answer with reassurance, to protect him from the discomfort of ambiguity. Instead, I answered honestly. "I'm clearer," I said. He studied me. About what? About myself. He didn't press further, because somewhere beneath the surface, he understood that clarity can alter structures, even if no one names it directly. The most significant consequence wasn't logistical, it was psychological. The version of me he had grown accustomed to, endlessly stabilizing, infinitely flexible, was gone. In her place stood someone steady but self-directed, supportive but not self-erasing. And that shift forced him to confront something uncomfortable. Had he loved me, or had he loved the ease I created? That question wasn't spoken aloud, but it lived quietly between us. I noticed him trying more, asking before committing to plans, including me explicitly in conversations about shared decisions, pausing to let me finish sentences. Effort, not perfection. And effort matters. But consequences don't disappear just because awareness arrives. Because while he was adjusting externally, I was adjusting internally in ways he couldn't see. My independence no longer felt like preparation. It felt permanent. I no longer feared the idea of standing alone, which meant I was no longer negotiating from fear. And when fear leaves, the balance of power shifts. Not aggressively, not destructively. Just undeniably, he felt it. I felt it. And neither of us could pretend we didn't. The question now wasn't whether he could adapt. It was whether the foundation we had built, on quiet imbalance, could sustain two fully defined individuals. Consequences don't demand immediate answers. They demand evolution. And not everyone evolves at the same pace. Awareness doesn't automatically repair what imbalance has worn thin. In the months that followed, Daniel tried. He asked more questions. He looped me into decisions earlier. He corrected himself mid-sentence when he interrupted. If this had happened 2 years earlier, it might have changed everything. But timing matters, because while he was learning to include me, I had already learned how to stand without needing inclusion. That difference is subtle, but irreversible. One evening, after we returned from a work event where I had been introduced as the lead on a major account, Daniel was unusually quiet. "You were impressive tonight," he said finally. "Thank you. I didn't realize how much responsibility you've been carrying." There was admiration in his voice, and something else, regret. I studied him carefully. His posture was slightly folded inward. His confidence, which once filled every room, is softer now in private. "Did you feel overlooked?" he asked. The question landed gently, but heavily. I considered lying, minimizing, saying, "Not really." Instead, I chose precision. "I felt underseen," I said, "for a long time." He inhaled slowly. "Why didn't you tell me?" There it was. The question people ask when consequences arrive. Why didn't you say something sooner? Because saying something would have required me to believe I deserved adjustment. Because I thought patience would inspire awareness. Because I was afraid that asking for more would make me harder to love. But I didn't list those reasons. "I didn't fully understand it myself," I answered honestly. And that was true. Marriage held up a mirror I wasn't ready to face. It showed me not just his blind spots, but my own accommodation of them. He moved closer to the couch. "I don't want you to feel that way," he said quietly. "I don't anymore," I replied. That's when it shifted. Not dramatically, but definitely. Because what he didn't realize was that I wasn't waiting for him to fix the past. I had already outgrown the need for retroactive repair. His efforts were sincere. I saw that. He was recalibrating, becoming more intentional, more aware. But the version of me who had once needed that acknowledgement had dissolved. In her place stood someone who no longer measured security by how well she was accommodated. Security now came from internal alignment. A week later, during a disagreement about scheduling, he caught himself mid-sentence. "I'm doing it again," he said, "assuming you'll adjust." "Yes," I replied calmly. He looked pained. "I'm trying. I know, and I meant it." But here's the quiet truth about timing. Sometimes the growth arrives after the trust and imbalance has already expired. Not in anger, not in bitterness, just in recognition. The emotional distance between us wasn't hostility. It was an asymmetry in realization. He was just beginning to understand the architecture of what I had carried. I had already dismantled it inside myself. One night, he said something that clarified everything. "I feel like I'm catching up to you." I looked at him carefully. "I've been here the whole time," I said. He nodded, but I could see it in his eyes. The dawning awareness that presence and recognition are not the same thing. Too late doesn't always mean separation. Sometimes it means the relationship survives, but in a different shape. The repair, when it comes after awakening, can feel like rebuilding a house that someone has already mentally moved out of. I wasn't gone, but I was no longer anchored by the same expectations. And once expectation dissolves, attachment transforms. The tragedy wasn't betrayal, it was delayed. He saw me clearly, finally, but I no longer needed him to. And that is a quiet, complicated kind of finality. The confrontation didn't erupt, it unfolded. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table on a quiet Sunday morning. No raised voices, no packed bags, just coffee growing cold between us. Daniel had asked for the conversation. I don't want to keep pretending everything is fine when it feels different, he said. Different. That word again. It is different, I agreed. He nodded slowly. Are you still in this? The question wasn't accusatory, it was vulnerable, and vulnerability deserves precision. I'm in honesty, I said. He waited. For a long time, I thought if I was patient enough, accommodating enough, you would eventually see me the way I needed to be seen. He looked down. I see you now, he said quietly. I know. Silence settled between us. Not tense, just heavy with recognition. But I had to see myself first, I continued. And once I did, I couldn't go back to negotiating my worth quietly. He exhaled slowly. I didn't realize I was benefiting from that. I didn't realize I was enabling it. That was the part that mattered. This wasn't a courtroom. There was no prosecution, no defense, just two people mapping the architecture of what had happened. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. Tell me what you need now. Years ago, that question would have flooded me with relief. I would have listed adjustments, specific behaviors, reassurances. Now the answer was simpler. I need a partnership, I said. Not dependence, not silent compensation. Partnership. He nodded. I want that too. I know you do, I replied. And I believed him. The confrontation wasn't about proving he had failed. It was about acknowledging that the version of us that once worked was built on imbalance, one I had quietly maintained. I was afraid to ask for more, I admitted. I thought being easy to love meant being easy to live with. His expression tightened slightly. You were never hard to love. But I was hard to fully see, I said gently. He absorbed that. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he asked the question that had been hovering unspoken. Is it too late? There was no anger in my answer. It depends, I said calmly. On what? On whether we can build something new without me shrinking to make it fit. He sat with that. This wasn't an ultimatum. I wasn't threatening departure. I wasn't demanding dramatic change. I was stating a boundary. The heat people expect in confrontations wasn't there, because I wasn't fighting to be understood anymore. I already understood myself, and that changes the temperature of everything. He reached across the table, not urgently, cautiously. I don't want the old version of you back, he said. I just don't know how to stand beside this one yet. The honesty in that made something soften inside me. That's fair, I replied. For the first time, we weren't negotiating roles. We were acknowledging reality. I wasn't asking him to transform overnight, and he wasn't asking me to retreat. We were facing the same truth from different timelines. The confrontation ended without resolution, but with clarity. We didn't promise dramatic reinvention. We didn't outline a 5-step repair plan. We agreed to something quieter, to stop pretending the imbalance was comfort, to stop confusing ease with intimacy, to stop assuming love excuses and visibility. As we stood from the table, nothing externally had changed. The apartment looked the same. The city outside continued in its gray rhythm. But something fundamental had shifted. Not anger, not forgiveness, alignment. And alignment doesn't need volume. It just needs honesty. I used to believe identity was something you preserved inside a relationship. Now I understand it's something you must actively protect. Who I am now isn't louder. I'm not sharper, not colder, not detached. I'm integrated. There's a difference. I no longer enter rooms calculating how to be the easiest version of myself. I don't pre-edit my opinions to ensure they land softly. I don't measure my worth by how seamless I make someone else's life. At work, I lead without apology. I delegate. I challenge. I allow silence to work in my favor instead of rushing to fill it. When someone questions my assessment, I don't dilute it with disclaimers. I explain it, and I stand by it. At home, I don't over-anticipate needs that haven't been expressed. If Daniel wants support, he asks. If I need space, I say it. We are still together, but not in the same way. There is less illusion now, less performance, more negotiation, but honest negotiation. Sometimes that honesty feels heavier than the old ease. There are moments when I can see him searching for the version of me who once absorbed friction automatically. She's not gone. She's just no longer overextended. And in her place stands someone steadier because she's no longer divided inside herself. The greatest shift hasn't been in how he treats me. It's in how I interpret what I accept. When he interrupts, rarely now, I finish my sentence without hesitation. When he assumes, I clarify. When something feels uneven, I address it before resentment has time to root. Not dramatically, directly. Marriage didn't break me. It revealed me. It showed me the ways I had confused patience with self-abandonment, the ways I had equated flexibility with virtue, the ways I had hidden behind competence so no one would question my value. Marriage held up a mirror I wasn't ready to face. And in that mirror, I didn't see a victim. I saw a woman who had been waiting for permission to occupy her full shape. I no longer wait. There's a quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can stay, or leave, from the same place of strength. I'm not staying out of fear. I'm not staying out of habit. I'm staying because, for now, the structure is adapting. If it stops adapting, I won't collapse with it. That knowledge changes everything. Daniel has grown. I won't deny that. He listens more, includes more, reflects more. But I don't frame that as a victory. It's evolution. And evolution only sustains if both people keep expanding. Who I am now is someone who doesn't negotiate against herself for harmony. Someone who understands that love without visibility slowly erodes intimacy. Someone who knows that being needed is not the same as being respected. I am still calm, still steady, still thoughtful, but I am no longer invisible inside those qualities. And that difference, subtle, internal, permanent, is the quietest form of dominance I've ever known. Not over him, over myself. When I entered marriage, I believed love would transform him. I thought if I modeled patience long enough, attentiveness would follow. If I stayed steady enough, inclusion would naturally grow. I believed growth was something I could inspire quietly. What I didn't expect was that the transformation would be mine, not louder, not angrier, not dramatic, just honest. Marriage held up a mirror I wasn't ready to face, and in it, I saw the parts of myself that were afraid to take up space, the parts that equated harmony with self-erasure, the parts that believed being easy to love meant being easy to overlook. There was no villain in this story. Daniel wasn't cruel. I wasn't powerless. We were simply operating inside a structure that rewarded my silence and never required his awareness. Until I stopped reinforcing it. The lesson wasn't that men need to change. It wasn't that marriage is a trap. It was this. If you consistently shrink to preserve peace, the relationship will adjust to your smaller shape. And one day you'll look up and realize you've disappeared in plain sight. Emotional justice for me wasn't revenge. It wasn't walking away in flames. It wasn't proving a point. It was alignment. It was recognizing that patience without boundaries becomes permission. That support without reciprocity becomes an imbalance. That love without visibility becomes loneliness. And it was choosing, quietly, steadily, to stand in my full capacity, whether the structure adapted or not. Some relationships end when this clarity arrives. Some evolve. Mine is still evolving. But the version of me who waits to be seen is gone. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, if you've ever told yourself, it's not that serious, while something small inside you kept remembering, I want you to ask yourself one question. Are you being patient, or are you negotiating against yourself? I'd love to know your thoughts. Have you ever entered a relationship expecting someone else to change, only to realize the mirror was pointed at you? Tell me in the comments. Let's talk about it.